Welcome, my darlings, to my humble chateau. Please make yourself very comfortable. Relax your mind and release your imagination to me. I will bring you a story to entrance and entertain. Perhaps a frightening one. Perhaps a steampunk. Perhaps a bit of mythology. Anyway, sit back, enjoy, and subscribe to me. A New English Tale by SirSlamChowder. These speculations you are insisting upon, sir, is not the topic for such polite company, asserted Dr. James, a disapproving scowl bending his Piccadilly weepers into an exaggeration of his frown. The young gentleman upon which the doctor's scolding gaze did fall showed no sign that he felt any of an expected sense of ignominy. He tugged sharply on his maroon waistcoat and reasserted his position to which the doctor had taken so great a reprobation. "Come, doctor, surely you, as a man of science and learning, must admit that such things might exist beyond our knowing. Why then is it so unthinkable that there might be such spheres that exist beyond our tangible or intellectual experience? And why, therefore, is it so distasteful to you, dear doctor, that such things might, from time to time, make exodus into our plane from their own? Because, young sir, it is not the idea that such things might be, but my remembrance of the proof to your assertion. In my younger years, shortly after leaving of Oxford, I took the opportunity to gain some practical experience in the city of Boston. I will admit that the Puritan history of the place played some role in my decision, for I had always taken more than a little interest in the superstitions of the founders. I was hopeful that in my off hours, when some of my colleagues might have taken to the local pubs, I might devote some time to extracurricular studies. My references from Oxford and my mentors did provide sufficient in the procurement of a job with a local physician, an aged man, himself hard of hearing, requiring assistance with the care of his patients. And so, in full flush of youthful adventure, I was soon after aboard a ship bound for Boston Harbor. The voyage over was thankfully uneventful. I soon found my sea legs amidst the rolling of the deck, and happily engaged the sailors in their down moments playing cards, singing shanties, and listening with ravenous rapture to the yarns they would spin. They were full of information about my new home, having made this voyage many times before, and divulged several useful anecdotes relating to such particulars which a young man might not find in a published travel book. Also in those yarns, the spun were tales of the older countryside around Boston proper. To these tales of witch trials and spectres, I listened as a schoolboy might a Christmas ghost story, and naturally my engagement encouraged seamen to tell me increasingly more fantastic stories. But in these, like all fictions, was contained glimpses of truth, place names and particulars too detailed to be concocted by the simple mind of an illiterate navyman, created for me a mental map of the area surrounding Boston, and by the time we made safe harbor, I had what I considered to be a decent understanding of the more wild regions of Massachusetts countryside. Upon my disembarkation, I found waiting for me a taxi carriage, hired by my employer, to bring myself and my effects to the home and office of that old physician in Bunker Hill. This was to be my home as well during my employment, as I had arranged to rent a spare room, previously occupied by his children, who were now grown. My ride was not unpleasant to my memory, though any bumps in the cobblestone would not have been registered by my seat, as I believe I spent the entirety of the trip craned gleefully out of the carriage window, soaking in the sights of Greater Boston. Soon we had arrived in Bunker Hill, and had stopped squarely before that impressive example of federal architecture which had been our destination. Red brick in its entirety, the house represented a bold, flat facade to the street without. Windows and doors surrounded by clean, whitewashed wooden sashes. The head jamb of the front door crowned with an excellent example en fresco of the American bald eagle, supporting olive branches within its talons. It rose 3 stories, each defined well by grand shutterless windows, which were sure to provide my eager mind with sufficient light for work without candle or gas. As I marveled at the grandeur of the place, its door swung open, and out hurried a plump woman of no more than 40, attired in a simple uniform of house staff. Hello there," she called in a cheery voice, that she made her way across the short front garden. "You must be Dr. James, all the way from England? How very exciting. I hope your trip was well. But lands, you must be exhausted and hungry by your journey. Well, let's collect your things and get you fed then." She smiled in a broad and warming way, before turning to the coachman. "Jack, can you bring his trunks just inside, and I'll sort it later. Come on then, Dr. James. Let's have you supped." Without waiting for my reply, she turned and led me inside. The interior of the house was colorful as the exterior was solid in its pigmentation. Bright and beautiful stamped floral wallpaper adorned the walls of the foyer, while pine wood floors, certainly original to the house, and ran the length of that open hall. Doors opened to the left and right, while stairs sported a carved scrolling banister ascended to the higher levels. The cabman placed my trunk just inside the door, and with a silent doff of his hat bid us farewell, closing the door behind him. The woman, after taking my coat and hat, led me to the right through an open door to a fine dining room, furnished with pieces of a date certainly no later than 1860, but not so fashionable as to be unsightly. "Make yourself at home, Doctor. I'm afraid the master will not be joining you for supper, as he has already retired. My name is Mrs. Bacon, and I'm the maid and housekeeper here. Should you require anything, please let me know. It's my pleasure to be of service. I have a bit of hen on the stove for you, sir, if that sounds agreeable. And what would you care to take with your supper? We do keep a good collection of wine and brandy here." "Thank you, Mrs. Bacon," I replied, as I took a seat on the left of the fine table, covered in fresh ironed blue linen. "Hen sounds perfectly wonderful, and I will take tea. I do not drink." She nodded, and with a curtsy she was off through a door to the kitchen, returning shortly with a plate of roasted chicken and vegetables, followed hereafter by a piping cup of rich black tea. After months of galley food aboard a ship, Mrs. Bacon's hen was a heavenly change for my palate, and I did consume it voraciously, and was soon reclining contentedly in that dining-room chair, lost in the moment, reflecting on my thoughts in my teacup. "Dr. James!" I gave a small jump, jarred from my pensivity. "Begging your pardon, sir," continued Mrs. Bacon. "I thought you might want to see your rooms before you retire." "Rooms?" I replied with some perplexity. "But my arrangement was for but one room." "Yes, sir, but there's also your examination room for the practice. And given your correspondence with the master, he has seen fit to convert one of the bedrooms into something of a study for your use as well." "Very well. Lead the way, Mrs. Bacon." I finished the well-steeped tea and rose. following her across the foyer to a freshly painted white door. She stopped and pulled a key from her apron, and after resolving the lock, swung the door open to reveal a smallish room furnished for my trade. It was not overly complex nor particularly modern, but it was clean and sufficient to the purpose of home medicine. Mrs. Bacon handed me the key and surveyed the room herself. "This is to be your examination room, Doctor. Patients' records are there." She pointed to a small stack of papers upon a writing desk in the corner. "And the key is yours to keep, as long as you practice here. If you need assistance, I was a nurse during the Great Rebellion, and I'm happy to lend a hand as needed. I will also keep your examination room orderly and sufficiently clean to practice medicine if you leave the door unlocked on Thursdays." I was pleasantly surprised at my good fortune in this regard. To have such a capable attendant certainly would afford me free time more than I expected to pursue my other interests. I thanked her profusely and was eager to lock up that room and see what might await me upstairs. The second floor was much like the first, a hallway containing the stairs up and down, flanked on each side by doors leading to further chambers. She led me to the right, where she indicated 2 doors. "On the left is your bedroom, which I have made up for you and unpacked your things. On the right is your study. Rather empty right now, I'm afraid, but I'm sure you'll fill it up with curiosities in no time. Now, if you excuse me, Doctor." She gave me another warm smile and curtsied. "Dinner needs cleaning up." Left alone, I took the opportunity to explore my rooms further, finding that I had been afforded lodgings far beyond my expectation. Fine oriental carpet in my room and red pattern wallpaper gave a warm and cozy atmosphere that I found muchly agreeable for such domestic quarters. A grand 4-poster was freshly made with clean linens and covered in a down patchwork quilt of the colonial fashion. My trunk sat at its foot, now empty, and its contents had been neatly arranged in an antique chest of drawers. A door on the interior wall led into the neighboring room, which was to be my study. A fine south-facing window provided an excellent view of the twilight glow over the city, and was sure to provide fine light for work during the day. 2 bookcases sat empty, save for those books which I brought from England, which Mrs. Bacon had evidently shelved for me. Along one wall, and a large writing desk sat perpendicular to those. There was some space for sitting in the way of 2 blue upholstered chairs, and a sideboard should I desire to entertain company. Overpleased with these arrangements, I returned to my bedchamber and readied myself for my first night in America. The next weeks passed swiftly, and I fell into a bit of a routine. The morning was occupied with patients possessed of all manner of local color. Lunch was served by the ever-valuable Mrs. Bacon at noon. Then I made rounds for the neighborhood, attending to house calls. I never did manage to meet my employer during those hours. Our schedules never aligned, and he preferring to take his lunch in his examination room. And upon my return from house calls, he had already supped and retired to his quarters on the 3rd floor. His patients spoke highly of him, though, and I was impressed second-hand by his reported good nature and bedside manner. My evenings I filled with my personal exploration of the city, taking long nocturnal strolls around the surrounding neighborhoods, or catching a coach to the harbor. I found myself acquiring knowledge in all manner of local oddities, and developed a familiarity with some of the queerer characters and legends. A few months passed in this way, and due to my discovery of a rather worldly bookshop, I filled my study with all manner of histories concerning my interests. Chief among these was local Puritan history, and their superstitions connecting witchcraft, the devil, and the occult. I found the more unsavory and esoteric the better, and on more than one occasion even drew some disapproval from the ever-sensible Mrs. Bacon upon her discovery of some volume or another I left lying around out of place. One instant going so far as to her implying that I might be taking such material too much to heart as to develop a stock in such mythology. Several hours was required to assure her that my interest was scholarly and historical, and I was not endangering my soul by attempting to resurrect such demonic legends, or recreate the strange patterns pictured in some of the German volumes with chalk on the floor of my study. Though I will say that I did find chalk a bit harder to come by in the house after that conversation. In my inquest, I repeatedly encountered the events of 1692, which took place in Salem Village, now called Danvers, not 30 miles north of Bunker Hill. Naturally, such detailed accounts of witchcraft should capture my attention. It was not long before I could recount the entirety of those events as well as the locals. I had decided before ere long to make an attempt to journey so far as a day trip might allow me in that direction, and with the yarns of sailors had told me in the legend, I had since learned as a guide, explored that countryside, as much as one was able in the course of an afternoon, perhaps finding lodging in the local inn if I should find anything of greater interest to my personal historical study. One spring Saturday, several months after my arrival, I found the opportunity to do just that. I had cleared my docket of patients and informed Mrs. Bacon of my intentions, who of course lectured me once more on the hazards of my hobby, before saying that she would prepare an early breakfast and a packed lunch for the benefit of my excursion. I awoke early before the grey twilight of the early morning had entirely cleared. I dressed quickly, ate my breakfast, and was out to the Danvers carriage to be northbound as soon as possible. My only companion was a daily post and a groggy coachman, whose mannerisms reminded me quite well of why I did not drink. Informing him of my intention to get off before Danvers to explore the countryside was met with a look of confusion, but I was not questioned due to either being his good graces and my status as a gentleman, or his attempt to restrain the contents of his breakfast from escaping. The townhomes and urban fixtures of Boston quickly gave way to the beautiful nature of Massachusetts' countryside. As we journeyed northward, a few hours later the city was lost behind farms and trees. At my desired mileage, the coach pulled to a stop and let me off, and grabbing my lunch basket, made my way to the countryside, which I had so longed to see. Great green hills rolled softly into the distance, only becoming lost in the numerous trees of a continuous forest that filled the horizon. Small farms with ancient and antique farmhouses dotted the land between the road and the forest, and a sign pointed down a dirt branch of the road towards some smaller town. But it had been so long since I had been to the country that I decided to walk to the forest and cut across the wilderness to the town rather than going directly to it. The fresh air was sure to do me good, and I was as interested in the wild wilderness, cautioned by so many Puritan contemporaries, as I was in local legend, so much so that it was as much a part of the legend in my mind as Cotton Mather or the witches. After all, it was in a wood similar to this one, which was said to have been the meeting place for the accused practitioners of black magic and the devil. And so, with those thoughts of New England legend in my mind, I wandered off as the crow flies towards the forest. An hour's walk saw me across the green field and into the forest. Great arboreal specimens that must have been as ancient an example that might exist in New England dominated the landscape all around me. My wandering mind must have carried my feet, for when I looked around, I could not see the edge of the trees and the beginning of those green fields I had traversed. Cursing for letting myself wander so far without notice, I gathered my resolve and began to walk in the direction from which I had come. I walked in that way for what must have been hours, without stopping, noting only the passing into afternoon by an onset of hunger and a consumption of my lunch, a beef and butter sandwich, a bit of Mrs. Bacon's hot milk cake, and a corked bottle of tea. No more than half an hour later, I spied, through the dense growth of the forest, a break in the trees, and the beginning of some meadowland. I think I had at last recovered from my lost wanderings. I bolted forward through the trees and out into the sun and grasses. To my disappointment, I had not found my way out, but rather into a small grassy clearing. Blades coming past my knees. The space seemed to be circular and devoid of any additional growth besides the tall meadow grass, and a singular oak which stood like an ancient gnawed sentinel over an equally ancient and twisted structure. At once I forgot my predicament of being lost, my excitement of this place's legend once again rising to full in my mind, pushing out any otherwise noted trepidation. I slogged forward through the thick and knotted grass as quickly as I could, without causing injury to my trousers or myself. It became easier to move forward as I got closer to the tree. The grass became shorter and more sparse, until it was brown and dead about 20 feet before I reached its trunk. I marveled at this oddity, that even in spring the grass should not grow well here, for what I assumed was the shadow cast by the great tree and building blocking healthy light from reaching the ground. The building, now that I was closer, had clearly been a barn or similar at one point, but now so dilapidated as to be barely distinguishable beyond its possession of 4 timber walls and the hint of support beams that in its vitality had supported a roof. Walking around the structure, I looked for a door or portal to the place, and was rewarded on one side by a large, heavy door with rusty iron fastenings, the type of simple lift latch common in early colonial buildings still held the door securely in its frame. The iron bar lifted easily, but the door did not budge from its frame. Years of rain and weather had swollen the wooden door into the jamb. Determined to uncover what might lie within, I backed a few paces, then with a swift move forward put my shoulder into the door by the rusted pin hinges. The old wood and brittle metal snapped with a ringing crack that reverberated across the clearing, and the door was lying in the dirt on the interior. The ringing echo faded, leaving me in full silence, and I stepped into the centennial building. There was no ruin of a floor, only hard-packed dirt, and I assumed that it had never been furnished with timber. On a side which I had not rounded on the exterior, I could see large double doors, maybe 10 feet high, common in agricultural buildings for the passage of livestock. These were secured with a chain from the inside, looped through the handles and fastened by a large black iron padlock. The roof, or what was left of those timbers, sat in rotted piles around the interior perimeter. The musty smell of old earth and rotted wood was pervasive and heavy. I was thankful that the roof was gone, lest I had encountered those odors of stale air and been unable to explore the place so thoroughly. And explore I did. overturning bits of old timber and remarking at the joining used in the construction. I shuffled over the dirt with my boot and discovered a slight raised spot in the back where I had entered, but otherwise found it level and void of seedlings. I took mental notes as well as I could and cursed myself for not bringing a sketchbook and charcoal. My study was all engaging, and I was focused wholeheartedly on absorbing as much of this place as I could when I heard a sudden and soft noise coming from outside. A gentle clucking, like metal upon metal, while someone walked. An incidental clanking of tools swaying, and the gait of their carrier. Some farmer come to investigate the racket of my demolition of the door, no doubt. I exited the old building to reassure the man I meant no harm or mischief. However, upon surveying the clearing, I saw that I was alone, and indeed, it was quiet. A gentle breeze blew across the clearing, and I felt a slight chill. Feeling somewhat exposed outside of the building, I resolved that I should continue my study, and if there was anybody here, they would find the burst portal, and thusly myself. Then another sound, this time behind me and within, scraping and dragging, like shovels at work, moving rocky hard earth. The hair on my arms and neck bristled. I was sure no one had walked past me, and the only other doors were locked from the inside. But I was sure of that sound, and there were persons at work on the floor of that abandoned building I had just left with shovels and spades. Hesitantly, I returned inside, slowly making my way over the door jamb. I saw that the building was abandoned as the clearing, and the noise was stopped. But I did not feel alone. A few more steps in, over that raised spot in the floor, I could truly see that there was no persons here with me. I began to admonish myself for being so childish. Strange noises in an old building on a breezy spring afternoon were perfectly natural, and my imagination, so filled by the consumption of New England legends over the month, had made me hear tools and digging where there was nothing more than a strong wind playing at old timber. Then the wind picked up, and a gust of heavy air whipped through the ruin, shaking the sky-exposed timber and rattling the freshly broken door frame. As the howling wind died, I heard a fresh sound from outside, the creaking, groaning strain of hemp fibers twisting in the breeze. I ran from that place and into the clearing, determined not to look anywhere but straight ahead. But in my periphery, I did see something, a body, dressed in only a dirty white petticoat, with gangrenous gray flesh, swinging by the neck from a hempen rope in that looming oak tree. Its face was contorted, purple tongue lolled lazily from swollen lips, eyes nearly bursting from their sockets, and as I ran past, the body seemed to swing, as to follow me with grotesque gaze out of that place. I flew without distraction or bearing, crashing into the woods with all my disregard. I do not know how long I ran or how far, but it was dark when I broke through the trees again, my lungs screaming for respite, and I found myself along the road, several miles north of where I had been let off that morning. After catching my breath, I walked south for a while along the road. But to some good fortune, it was not long until my groggy coachman from that morning passed me, going southward himself. He drew up and I climbed in, eager to return to my fire rooms in Bunker Hill and put this wild place behind me. A few hours' ride went quickly in an exhausted slumber, and my next recollection was being roused by Mrs. Bacon in the soft light of the street lamps. She tutted me for letting my adventures get so out of hand, tattering my clothing and having lost the lunch basket she packed for me. But in her kind way, she saw me to bed, washed, and with a fresh cup of tea. The next morning I came down for breakfast early, as I had slept fitfully with tremendous and dark dreams. In some reflection, I had concluded that I had imagined the events of the previous day. Perhaps I had taken to some waking dream in my being lost, and my imagination had taken a firm hold of my mind in some sort of hysteric episode. "Good morning, Dr. James," chirped Mrs. Bacon. "Good morning, Mrs. Bacon. The master is at church, I assume," I replied, as it was often my employer's habit to take the earliest service on Sundays. "Yes, sir, but I have a good breakfast of eggs and sausage for you. Oh, and a bit of good news. Your lunch basket was found. Its way home. I suppose some farmer you had visited yesterday had taken possession of it and seen it delivered back to you by the way of the morning produce, as I found it on the kitchen stoop along with the eggs. Look!" She brought the basket up to the dining room table from where she had placed it on the floor. "All of your things are still here. No harm for having lost my basket in the woods." She smiled at me jokingly before looking at the basket, whence smile turned to a look of exasperation. "Really now, Doctor, what's this? Another macabre curiosity?" She reached into the basket, and when I saw what she'd pulled out, I lunged across the table and dashed it out of her hand. On the floor lay a moldy green, spotted length of frayed hemp rope. So quoth this raven. My darlings, we all know New England is the cradle and birthplace of horror in America, with Poe, Lovecraft, and King all coming from such a spot. This Victorian-aged little gem by SirSlamChowder was certainly fun. I have my own connections to Salem, my darling. Sadly, it is not a witch I am a direct descendant of, but a judge. But the sins of the fathers, yes? I doubt he'd approve of this habit of mine. But if you liked my tale, please give me a like. Subscribe and ring the bell if you haven't, so you know when to come up and see me. And if you give me a comment, tell me your favorite horror at this wonderful, spooky time of year, and I will comment back. Thank you, my darlings.